Hey everybody, I have had the request to go over the cranial nerves that have parasympathetic fibers. First of all, the cranial nerves that have parasympathetic fibers would be cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. Oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. All the others don't have parasympathetic fibers. So, why don't we start off? The way that this is organized is that I actually can click on the different buttons and that will move us forward to whatever nerve I want to have. This file, for those who are students of mine, is downloadable from our learning management system, of course. If I click back, it brings us back to the home screen. Okay, let's start off with number 3. Okay, the oculomotor nerve, number 3. It says GSM and GVM. That means general somatic motor and general visceral motor. The visceral motor is going to be the parasympathetic. Okay, this symbol here, the X in a circle, indicates that there is going to be parasympathetics in here as well. The way that I do it is I have the dashed line, or the dotted line here, stands for presynaptic parasympathetics. Okay, we will see that the cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, will leave through the superior orbital fissure. Let's see what other information we have. We can also see, if we follow the dashed line, that the parasympathetic fibers from the oculomotor nerve will synapse in a ganglion called the ciliary ganglion. The ciliary ganglion is actually a very small ganglion that is within the orbit, about a centimeter or so from the back of the, or posterior aspect of the eyeball, close to the optic nerve. Yeah? Well, the postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers from there on can act on the ciliary muscle and the pupillary sphincter. Okay, the ciliary muscle is able to help change the shape of the lens, so to change with accommodation, and the pupillary sphincter, of course, well, when we have the sphincter, we make the pupil smaller to limit the amount of sunlight that actually gets into our eyes. The other fibers of the oculomotor nerve are these GSM fibers that goes to all the extraocular muscles except for 2 of them, right? There are 2 extraocular muscles that have their own nerves. That would be the abducens nerve that goes to the lateral rectus, and the superior oblique muscle that is innervated by the trochlear nerve. To illustrate what's actually going on, I made this diagram here, and this is supposed to show us the course of fibers to the eyeball. Okay, I have a different color scheme here. You have general sensory, postsynaptic sympathetic, presynaptic parasympathetic, and postsynaptic parasympathetics. Okay, general sensory, of course, we need. That is actually coming from V1, from the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. That goes, for instance, to the cornea, because the cornea has to be very sensitive to touch and pain in general, because, well, if our cornea gets ulcerated, we might turn blind. The sympathetic fibers we will find here are only going to be postsynaptic, because they will have synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. So they do absolutely nothing in the ciliary ganglion. They just travel right through. They will either travel through and go to intraocular blood vessels, or they will actually go to the dilator pupillae, because that actually opens up the pupil to let more sunlight in. It's the parasympathetic fibers from the oculomotor nerve that synapse here. Your parasympathetic fibers come into the ciliary ganglion, synapse, and travel as now a solid line as postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers travel all the way here to the ciliary body to change the shape of the lens, or to the sphincter pupillae. When the ciliary body is stimulated by these parasympathetic fibers, it contracts, which allows the lens to get a little bit more spherical or round like a marble, which will help you for distance vision. And that was basically it for cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve. Next in line, we have cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. So let's see what we have going on with the facial nerve. So first of all, we can see the facial nerve has a couple of modalities, right? It has general sensory, special sensory, parasympathetic, and motor fibers. Very well. This indicates that the facial nerve will leave the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus. This, however, does not indicate where it exits the cranium. Yeah, there are different places where parts of it at least can exit. Okay, so fine. General sensory, special sensory, parasympathetic, and motor. The general sensory is actually for sensation from the external part of the ear. The special sensory, or special visceral sensory, is from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. from the hard palate and soft palate. But I would say the most important is that you know that it is anterior 2/3 of the tongue that receive special sensory fibers from the facial nerve. Then your parasympathetic fibers, well, they're going to be important, for instance, for tear production from the lacrimal gland and for saliva production from the submandibular and sublingual glands. And most importantly here, the motor fibers. Well, all muscles of facial expression are innervated by the facial nerve. So let's expand this a little bit because it does get a little bit more complex. So here now, I've added in some more information. First of all, we see here that the red fibers, in this case these are motor fibers, exit through the stylomastoid foramen. It's a little opening between the styloid process and the mastoid process, goes to the muscles of facial expression. Very well. In addition to that, we can see that we have the sensory fibers going to the external acoustic meatus and the deep ear or auricle. We have another nerve coming off called the chorda tympani. The chorda tympani is going to be the part of the facial nerve that will carry your special sensory taste fibers and your parasympathetic fibers. You do have a side branch though, which is called the greater petrosal nerve. That's another part of the facial nerve that carries parasympathetic fibers. The greater petrosal nerve will join the so-called deep petrosal nerve that has sympathetic fibers and form a new nerve called the nerve of the pterygoid canal, often also called the Vidian nerve, like video but Vidian. The parasympathetic fibers will synapse in a ganglion called the pterygopalatine ganglion. Then these fibers can go to the lacrimal gland to make tears. Now if we look down here, we can see again our chorda tympani that has our taste fibers and parasympathetics. The chorda tympani will join this nerve, which is called the lingual nerve, which comes from the trigeminal. So now the lingual nerve that only had general sensory fibers first is now blessed with special sensory taste fibers and parasympathetics. The parasympathetics will go down to another ganglion called the submandibular ganglion. That indicates its location. It actually hangs off of the lingual nerve. And from there on, now postsynaptic parasympathetic fibers can go to the sublingual and submandibular glands to make saliva. So now with a little bit more information, you can see some of the motor branches of the facial nerve. That would be temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical. The mnemonic we use for these here is 10 zebras bit my cheek. And the facial nerve also provides motor innervation to the stylohyoid and posterior belly of the digastric. The last bit of information is over here. This is supposed to depict the internal carotid artery because the sympathetic fibers that have synapsed in the superior cervical ganglion will travel with periarterial plexuses or plexi that are around the internal carotid artery. Next in line is cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve has a bunch of different modalities as well, right? It has GSS, which is general somatic sensory, to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, external ear, and middle ear cavity. It has general visceral sensory from the carotid body and sinus. It has special sensory for taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. It has parasympathetic fibers that are going to be important because they go to the parotid gland to help make saliva, and motor fibers that go to the stylopharyngeus muscle. Take note of the presynaptic parasympathetic fibers here. They are running along, going to the otic ganglion, that's what it stands for. And after that, they actually hitch a ride on the auriculotemporal nerve, which is a branch of V3. So it's from the trigeminal nerve. They hitch a ride on this nerve to get to the parotid gland to make saliva. And then last but not least, we have number 10, the vagus nerve. Some call it the wanderer as well because it actually goes very far in the body. Okay, the vagus nerve does a lot of things as well. We have general sensation from the external ear, larynx, and pharynx. We have general visceral sensation from the larynx, pharynx, and thoracic and abdominal viscera, because up to the left colic flexure is where we have parasympathetic supply with the vagus nerve. Also, we get motor supply to the muscles of the pharynx and larynx. We get taste from the epiglottis region of the tongue. And down here we see that we have parasympathetic fibers that go to smooth muscles of your pharynx, larynx, and most of the gut. Well, you might know the sayings fight or flight and rest or rest and digest. Well, this is the rest and digest part because parasympathetic stimulation of these smooth muscles in the gut leads to increased peristalsis. So that's the resting and digesting. Well, and then here if I expand the rest of the information here, we can see specifically where the GVS fibers, for instance, go to esophagus, heart, foregut, midgut, viscera, lungs, bronchi. Motor fibers are going to go to all muscles of the pharynx except for the stylopharyngeus. Motor fibers also go to all laryngeal muscles and all muscles of the palate except for one, the tensor veli palatini. Special sensory fibers will go to the external acoustic meatus, the laryngopharynx, and the deep auricle. And your special visceral motor fibers will go to the pharynx, larynx, thoracic, and abdominal viscera. That was all, folks. I hope it was helpful.